Hello, Kate. Are you with us? Yes.
Hello, I'm with you. I can hear you now.
I'm Ebba Boye. I'm the leader of Rethinking Economics Norway, and I'm going to give you an introduction first before you start your talk.
Okay.
And I just want to say it's a great honor to introduce you here today. Kate Raworth.
Well, it's an honor to join you.
And Kate Raworth, she finished her economics degree at Oxford University. But feeling that her economics studies did not give her the answers she was looking for, she moved away from the economics field for a while. This took her, among other places, to working with micro-entrepreneurs in the villages of Zanzibar. She also co-authored the Human Development Report for UNDP. She has worked for a decade as a senior researcher at Oxfam. And now she's back in the economics field, and she's back to change it. Her mission is to put a better understanding of real-life economics back into the economics education, and to change fundamentally how young economists understand their role in society. She's now a senior visiting research associate at Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute, where she teaches at the master's program in environmental change and management. She's a senior associate at Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And there's a long list there. I just wanted to say the breadth of what she's doing. She's a member of the Club of Rome. She serves on several advisory boards, including the Stockholm School of Economics Global Challenges Program, the University of Surrey's Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, and Oxford University's Environmental Change Institute. So as you can hear, there was no time to fly to Norway, and most of all, no CO2 quota to use to fly here. But I've heard you before speaking at the New School in New York, and she's an amazing speaker, and I'm sure that she will get you engaged through the screen. And she's now written Doughnut Economics. And I want to say, Kate, thank you for getting back into economics. I was truly inspired by your book when I read it and reviewed it for Klassekampen. Like so many others have felt when reading your book, it just sums up so many of the thoughts I had about the goals for economy and my role as an economist. And it puts it all into a narrative that sticks and that you can talk about. Reading your book gave me such an increased hope that we can actually change the economy for the better. And that hope gives me energy to keep up the fight. Your theory builds on so many of the economic thoughts and schools that are not part of the curriculum today. But when I first heard your talk in New York at the New School, and there was the same short time frame that we have today, it's hard to really delve into the details. So the talk, as I experienced it, was an overview to get us all engaged and interested in actually reading the book. But please, everyone, read the book. That's where all the details are. That's where this new framework is carefully built up to a coherent vision and a narrative of what steps lie ahead. So now I'm going to give Kate Raworth the floor, and afterwards there will be a good round of questions. So please prepare your questions for Kate. And Kate, take it away.
Thank you very much, Ebba. That's probably one of the most lovely introductions I've been given, especially coming from you as a student, because I wrote this book to be the book that I wish I could have read when I was a student, which would have helped me make sense of what I was being taught and what didn't make sense in it to me. So I'm really delighted by that. I'm going to share my screen. Now I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Right, can you see my PowerPoint nice and clearly? Yes. You can put your thumbs in the air if you can. Okay, oh yes, there we go, excellent. And I'm sorry, I know my little face is appearing on the screen, and I hope it's not going to be in the wrong place too much, but I hope we'll make sense of this. Okay, so as it was said, I studied economics, and I was very frustrated by what I was taught. So I walked away from it. I worked in Zanzibar, I worked at the United Nations, I spent a decade working with Oxfam, and I became a mother, all different aspects of the economy, and I decided to come back towards economics, but not come back on its terms, come back on our terms, come back with a new vision, so to flip economics on its head. And I've long been very inspired by this quote. This is Buckminster Fuller, the American inventor from last century. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And I find that very profound, because sometimes the best form of protest is to propose something new. It's easier to critique, it's harder to propose. So we need to go beyond critique. The time for mere critique is past. It is time to be propositional, which is what I aim to do with this book. Bringing together many schools of economic thought, from feminist, institutional, ecological, complexity, behavioral economics. See what happens when you put them together on one page. So I sat down to draw a vision for humanity in the 21st century, and ridiculous though it sounds, and unhealthy though it sounds, it comes out looking like a donut. So let me explain this donut to you. In the space in the middle is the place where people are falling short on life's essentials, where people lack having sufficient food or energy, healthcare, peace, social equity, housing. And these 12 social dimensions, I have crowdsourced them from the Sustainable Development Goals. So they are the most contemporary statement of what the international community agrees is a basic claim of every human being, so that every person can lead a life of dignity, opportunity, and community. So we want to get everybody in the world out of that hole in the middle, over the social foundation of well-being. But we cannot overshoot that outer crust of the donut, because there we put so much pressure on the systems of this extraordinary living planet that we begin to kick them out of kilter. We cause climate breakdown, we acidify the ocean, we cause massive biodiversity loss, we pollute the air, pollute the soils. So these are the 9 planetary boundaries which were first drawn up in 2009 by Johan Rockström and a group of around 30 leading Earth system scientists from worldwide. And they said, what is it about the last 11,000 years of stable and benevolent climate on this planet that has kept us in this stability? And they believe that these 9 Earth system processes together maintain that stability. So we can't push ourselves out of kilter on any of them without risking pushing the whole system into a far more hostile state for humanity. So that's the donut. We want to get everyone over the social foundation, but remain below the ecological ceiling. In the most simple of words, how do we meet the needs of all within the means of the planet? And I believe this can act as a compass for humanity in the 21st century. It is the foundations for human well-being. And if it is a compass, then we need to know where the needles are pointing. And it's not good news. On every one of those social dimensions, millions, indeed billions of people are falling short. So on food, for example, that little red wedge goes 11% of the way towards the center of the circle, because 11% of people worldwide are undernourished. Water uses 2 indicators. One, 13% of people don't have access to clean water. 32% of people, 1 in 3, doesn't have access to what we would call a toilet. But you can see this is the case for all of those social foundations. And yet we have already overshot at least 4 of the planetary boundaries on climate change, phosphorus and nitrogen use in fertilizers, land conversion and biodiversity loss. And on air pollution and chemical pollution, we don't even know where we are. So this is the state of humanity at the beginning of the 21st century. And it's an indictment, I believe, of the economic path of progress that we have pursued to date, because it leaves millions of people without their most basic needs, while we have already overshot the collective pressure that we can put on the planet without risking destroying everybody's well-being. So what would it look like to turn this around? What would it look like to actually start putting humanity on track for moving into the donut for the first time in human history? Well, economists from the last century didn't have this picture. They focused on the social foundation. They didn't see the outer limits. They didn't see that balance that needs to be created. So it's no surprise that their concepts are not going to equip us to take on this challenge. I believe with a new compass, we need a new economic story and new economic theories. But if we do need a new economic story, I believe that story must come with new pictures, because many of the world's most powerful stories are those told with pictures. Copernicus knew that. Back in the 1500s, he was watching the motion of the planets, and he knew that Ptolemy here, whose picture puts the Earth unmoving at the center of the universe, Copernicus knew that Ptolemy had it wrong, but he waited until he was on his deathbed before he dared to publish his own alternative, because by putting the sun, not Earth, at the center of the universe, he was threatening.
Kate, you've dropped out slightly, so if you could repeat that last bit about Copernicus when you come back.
Copernicus put the sun at the center of the diagram, and he knew that that mere shift diagrams threatened to upend the power of the church, questions man's in the universe. And so it's extraordinary what havoc a few concentric circles can unleash. Drawing a new picture can be revolutionary. So if that's the case, we should think very carefully about the diagrams at the heart of economics, because these diagrams are taught to every economics student. They're so simple, they look harmless. In fact, I think they're deeply dangerous because they slip into our heads without being questioned, without being put into words. And they claim to answer some of the most powerful questions that we are taking on without ever addressing them. Questions like, what is the economy? What is it for? How does it work? And who are we? And my trouble with these diagrams is that today's students, those in university learning these diagrams now, are going to be the policymakers taking us through this century, through past 2050. But these diagrams come out of the textbooks of 1950, and they're based in turn on the theories of 1850. So given the challenges of the 21st century, from climate change to extreme inequality to financial crisis, this is shaping up to be a disaster. If we're going to tell a new story, we need new pictures. We could ask for no better guide than this gentleman. This is Paul Samuelson. He taught at MIT in the 1940s, and he knew the power of writing the textbooks and drawing the pictures. He said, I don't care who writes a nation's laws or crafts its advanced treaties, so long as I can write its economics textbooks. The first lick is the privileged one, impinging on the beginner's tabula rasa at its most impressionable state. So watch out, because Paul Samuelson clearly thinks your mind is a blank slate, and he's going to lick it. And of course, he has already licked it, because Samuelson's drawings are the ones that shape the way we all think about what the economy is. So when he sat down in the 1940s to draw a picture of the economy, he wanted to make it easy for his students, and he was teaching engineers at MIT. So he drew the economy looking a bit like a pair of radiator tanks with water flowing through those pipes. He's got business and public, today we would call public households, and you can see that income flows round and round, just like water flowing through pipes. Well, this diagram was incredibly useful because it shows the flow, the circularity of money and goods moving through the economy, but it's changed only a little bit in the last 70 years. Today, every student knows it as the circular flow diagram. We've got the essential market relationship of households and business. Households exchange their labor and capital for wages and profit, and in return, they spend that money and get goods and services. So the money goes round and round, and so do the resources. And yes, there are some leakages off. Not all of that money is spent. Some of it goes as savings into banks, and they turn it into investment. Some of it is taken as taxes by government, and they spend it. Some of it is taken off as for imports, but it comes back with money from exports. This is actually still the biggest picture of the economy that mainstream economics can show us. And I'm not even going to talk about the little lie that's in the middle of it, which is that banks merely take our savings and turn them into investments. That's completely not true. That's not what banks do. I'm not even going to go there today because there's some bigger challenges that I want to take on. This diagram, of course, tracks what is monetized. But if that's going to be the biggest picture that we have of the economy in the 21st century, then really we are starting in trouble, because there are some extraordinary silences and blank spaces in this diagram. It says absolutely nothing of the living world. All of the materials and matter and energy that are drawn daily into the economy and spewed out as waste and pollution. It says nothing of the unpaid caring work of parents and families, all the cooking, washing, cleaning, sweeping, raising children that goes into making that labor fresh and ready for work every day. And it says nothing of the commons, the place where people get together, not with the market and not with the state, but as a community, and they co-organize to produce things that they value. Well, if you're going to use a picture, the biggest picture of the economy that says nothing about the living world, nothing about unpaid caring work, and nothing about the commons, then you are missing three of the deepest sources of our well-being, and those silences are going to bounce back to bite us. Now, Samuelson got to define the picture of 20th century, what the economy is. What about who we are? That story goes back to Adam Smith. And Smith had a nuanced understanding of human nature, because he knew that self-interest is powerful for making markets work, but that our interest in others is essential for making society work. And he celebrated our sense of public justice, generosity, public spirit, compassion. He said these were the traits most valuable to others. But that nuance got in the way of modeling. So when later economists came along, like John Stuart Mill, and they wanted to create a model of humanity to put in economic theory, Mill said political economy doesn't treat the whole of man's nature, but just as a being who desires to possess wealth. He just plucked out that DNA of self-interest and created the character that we all now know as rational economic man. Well, his portrait is never actually drawn in the textbook, so I decided to make a picture of him, and he would have to look a bit like this. He's a man, standing alone. He has money in his hand, ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and nature at his feet. He hates work, loves luxury, and he knows the price of everything. And the problem with this character is not just how absurdly narrow he is. The real problem is what looking at him does to us, what he's doing to you. Because research has found that the more that economic students learn about rational economic man as they go through their degree, the more they come to value self-interest and competition over collaboration and compassion and altruism. So who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become. And what began as a model of man turns into a model for man. We've all heard people saying, well, the way you're behaving isn't rational. That's not economically rational, as if we should be like him. If there's going to be more than 10 billion human beings on this planet this century, and we continue to imagine and conduct and justify ourselves as rational economic man, I think we stand very little chance of thriving here together. What about how the economy works? Back in the 1870s, a few economists were determined to make economics a science as reputable as physics, and so they looked to the leading science of the day, that of Isaac Newton and his physical laws of motion. This is Newton's diagram of gravity pulling a ball to an object to rest. And so when William Stanley Jevons started drawing his own economic diagrams, he drew them just in the style of Newton. It looks like physics. It smells like physics. It must be physics. And this diagram you can see drawn by Jevons, this is probably the first diagram that every student encounters today, the diagram of supply and demand. It's drawn exactly based on an analogy with Newtonian physics. He reasoned that just as gravity pulls an object to rest, so prices pull a market into equilibrium. And he and Leon Walras in Switzerland started talking about the market mechanism, market forces. You can hear the Newtonian physics language in that concept of the economy. Well, the really pernicious effect of this has not just been the idea that markets are pulled around by gravity. Anyone who lived through the 2008 financial crisis knows that gravity is not really a very good metaphor for how markets actually behave. The really pernicious effect is that it set economists off in search of economic laws of motion, just as Newton had discovered the physical laws of motion. And once they had data, they began to try to uncover these laws. And two laws have been extraordinarily influential over the past half century. They both look incredibly similar to each other. So the first one in the middle of the screen is the Kuznets curve, drawn by Simon Kuznets in 1955. He had a little bit of data on income inequality over time in the UK, Germany, and the US. And he said, I think I see a pattern that as economies get richer, first inequality increases, but then it falls. He also said, this doesn't make sense to me. I would expect the rich to get richer, not the poor to catch up. So he tried to explain it with some hypothesis about rural to urban migration, even though he had no grounds for his hypothesis. He admitted he had 5% data, 95% speculation, and probably some wishful thinking, and said it would be terrible if this became an unwarranted, dogmatic generalization. Of course, that's exactly what happened, and I believe it's the power of the image that goes so quietly into our heads and shapes our deep beliefs, because this image whispers out a mantra that if you care about inequality, don't try to redistribute, that's socialist and bad. If you care about inequality, first it has to get worse before it can get better, and growth will make it better. The second curve comes in the 1990s, drawn so similarly they called it rather unimaginatively the environmental Kuznets curve. Again, some local air and water pollution data. A pattern appears to emerge that if you care about the environment, first it has to get worse, but then it will get better. And like a well-trained child, growth will clean up after itself. These two curves have had huge influence. The first one justifying trickle-down economics, austerity economics. Tighten your belt, the better future ahead, but we have to go through the economic pain of inequality. The second one, grow now, clean up later, has been a mantra and still is used in many countries today, but both of them are false laws of motion. The data underlying them are circumstantial, they are of the era, they are of only local pollutants. If you take the full data set and look over time, these laws do not exist. Economics is not a question of uncovering laws, it's a question of design, and for me that's probably the most important take-home point. So that's how the economy works. These laws were false, but they were a jolly good excuse for the purpose that the economy was given, the purpose of growth. And again, poor Simon Kuznets, who was a brilliant economist, was involved in this because in the 1930s, US Congress asked him to come up with a measure for the first time of the value of the goods and services sold in the US economy. It's what we now know as GDP. Kuznets created it, but he said this can hardly be used to take a measure of a nation's welfare, because he knew all the missing spots from the beginning. It doesn't take account of the unpaid caring work of parents. It doesn't take account of the value created by communities. And it's just a flow measure. It's not measuring what's happening in the stocks underneath. So he was one of the most outspoken critics of his own measure. But the value, the temptation of a single number by which to measure your economy's success. And then when you have international tables comparing the US with the USSR and with Europe, well, now we have a horse race. So this number has been put at the heart of economic policymaking to the point that today our economies are dependent upon continual growth. Indeed, in the 60s, W.W. Rostow wrote a book called The Stages of Economic Growth. Hang on, let me grab it for you. Where is it? Oh, I can't see it on my shelf. I wanted to show you my original copy. I got myself an original copy because it's such a powerfully influential book. He said there are 5 stages of economic growth. First, there's a traditional society, nothing's really happening. Then there's the preconditions for takeoff. You get the beginnings of a financial industry, beginnings of mechanization, education for work. Nation must be touched with a certain nationalism and a belief that growth is good for something beyond itself, like a better life for the children. Then there's takeoff, where growth becomes the normal condition and the march of compound interest will bear its blessings. Then you have the drive to maturity. And finally, the last stage is the era of high mass consumption, where you can buy all the consumer goods you want. Now you can hear the metaphor embedded in this of the airplane ride. The trouble with this airplane ride is that we have been left flying into the sunset on a plane that can never be allowed to land, because growth has been built into the very structure of the economy. And Rostow knew this. He asked the question beyond, where history offers us only fragments: what to do when the increase in real income, it loses its interest? But he didn't answer that question because he was an advisor to the presidential candidate John F. Kennedy in 1960, and Kennedy was running for election on a promise of a 5% growth rate. So Rostow's job was to keep that plane in the sky, not to ask if and how it could ever be allowed to land. So that's a quick tour of the 20th century mindset. And I've shown you the caveats, the blank spaces, all the holes and blind spots in these diagrams. They look quite flimsy, but I believe that it's on the basis of those holes and those blind spots and the unspoken values that powerful stories have been built. In fact, 70 years ago, in 1947, a small band of economists met in a little Swiss village called Montpellier, and they came up with a new economic story. We have Friedrich Hayek here, Milton Friedman. They said they were going to write the new story, call it neoliberalism. And the idea was to push back against the rise of state totalitarianism. They believed that if you give the state an inch, it will take a mile. Indeed, it will take the whole damn lot. So you have to minimize the role of the state in the economy. That was the basis of their belief. But it very quickly morphed into market fundamentalism, the idea that everything can best be arranged through market provisioning, through market supply and demand. They began their ideas in the 1940s and seeded them in think tanks and professorships in universities and in business chambers of commerce and in political parties. And it was only in the 1980s, when Reagan and Thatcher came to power, that the story was actually put on the international stage. And I believe we've been living by the script of this story ever since. So here's the cast of characters. The neoliberal story of economics stars the market, which we're told is efficient, so give it free rein. It stars finance, which is infallible, so trust in its ways. It stars trade, which is win-win, so open your borders. And the state, every powerful story has a villain, so the state is incompetent, so don't let it meddle. Other actors not really needed on screen, but we can meet them anyway. There's the household. Well, that's domestic. You can leave it to the women. The commons are tragic. The one thing we know about the commons is the tragedy of the commons, so we should sell them off. Society, as Thatcher said, there is no such thing as society, so we can ignore that. Earth is inexhaustible, so take all you want. And power, we don't need to talk about power in economics. This is a positive, objective science. Power is irrelevant, so don't mention it. I believe this story has been taking us on this journey to the brink of collapse, where we are today at the most technologically equipped stage of human existence ever. And yet millions of people do not have enough food, water, shelter, or health, education. And we have already overshot our limits on this extraordinary planet because we never even asked ourselves how we related to it. So we need to turn the story around. Can we bring ourselves back? I believe this is our generational challenge. And to do so, if we're going to tell a new story about economics, of course, I believe we need to do it with new pictures. So let me give you a quick overview of what I believe is the beginnings of a new 21st century story of economics. First, if I'm teaching in a class, I want to put purpose at the heart of it. So what is the purpose of the economy? I believe the purpose is precisely to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. And the question that obsesses me is what kind of economic mindset will give us the best chance of achieving this? What will be the best way to equip today's students if they were going to have even half a go at making this succeed? Because it's not going to be easy. Well, the first diagram I would show them, the first image I would put into their minds, I would not show them supply and demand, nor would I show them Samuelson's radiator system. I would show this, and I call it the embedded economy diagram. We have the economy embedded within society and all the social political institutions, embedded within the living world, drawing in materials and matter, spewing out waste matter, and flowing through with a river of solar energy. So immediately we ask the core question of ecological economics, which is how big can the economy be in relation to the earth on which it depends before its through flow begins to kick us out of equilibrium, kick us out of the stability of the planetary home on which we depend. But you can see within the economy too, it's divided into 4 core provisioning sectors, not just the market and the state. That was a 20th century ideological boxing match. You know, are you for laissez-faire free market capitalism or are you a state-loving socialist? And in that argument, we couldn't see that actually there's the household, which is the place where we all begin every day, the unpaid caring of parents, children, partners, neighbors, where we look after our fundamental well-being, but also the commons, that place where we co-organize, whether it's creating a garden on the corner of our neighborhood block with all of our neighbors, or creating Wikipedia or Linux online with a global digital community. The power of the commons is resurgent, and we need to bring it into our language and into our economic vision. Lastly, finance, it's a flow, and it should be a service. What would it look like to create finance that was actually in service to this form of economic provisioning, in service to life? A very different kind of finance than we have today. What about us? We're not rational economic man. We are far more interesting than that. We move from the me to the we of humanity. Yes, we have self-interest. We like competition, but we're also socially reciprocating. We cooperate with others, and we punish them when they don't cooperate back. We're not isolated, but deeply interdependent. Psychology, neuroscience. It's the most important portrait for the 21st century, because who we shapes who we become. So we need to get this one right. How does the economy work? Forget the Newtonian physics and the idea of gravity and thinking. And if you never got that.
Beklager det. Jeg prøver å ringe opp med en gang. Det var antageligvis nettverk som har droppet et sted på veien.
I'm still here.
Ah, fantastic. Then we'll just continue.
But your thoughts are just going on with the ticket.
Yeah, and I think you'll need to share your screen again.
Well, maybe we do it out.
Oh, I need to share my screen again. Thank you. Okay, I'll share my screen again. Hang on. Come on back, Skype.
Do you need the rest of your
Skype fails on us sometimes, but you have to love it. It's pretty amazing. Here we go.
Do you need the rest of the slides? Yeah.
There we go. The chicken. So these two loops are the fundamentals of systems thinking. I'm going to say something. If at any point you can't hear me clearly or I cut out, several of you in the audience just do this, okay? And then I'll know to stop talking. That will help. Okay. Systems thinking. These are two feedback loops. The one with an R in the middle is a reinforcing feedback loop. The idea of it is the more you have, the more you get. The more chickens you have, the more eggs you get. And the more eggs you have, the more chickens you get. So anything in the world that behaves like spiraling up and up and up, or spiraling down and down and down, is dominated by reinforcing feedback. The other one is balancing feedback. And the idea is that the more you have, the less you get back. The more chickens you have, the more try to cross the road. And the more that try to cross the road, I'm afraid the fewer come back. So that's a balancing, capping something off. Our bodies are brilliant at that. When I talk about economics, I get excited. When I get excited, I get hot. So my body tries to cool me down and tries to sweat to make me cool down. And that's what keeps us in balance in temperature. But these two ideas, reinforcing feedback and balancing feedback, most of the interesting phenomena in this extraordinary world can best be understood through this method. Whether it's the dynamics of your family relationships at Christmas, whether it's the boom and bust of stock markets, the rise of the 1%, the collapse of ecosystems, systems dynamics really give us a powerful entry point into understanding. This diagram you see on the screen, that's a murmuration of starlings all flying together, following a simple rule, but their collective behavior has an incredible emergent property, which makes it inherently unpredictable. And that means economists need to take a metaphorical career change. Don't be a Charlie Chaplin trying to pull on the levers of the economy because it's not a machine and the levers of control are not there. Be more like Josephine Baker. She's here watering her garden. The economy is evolving all the time. It has emergent properties that can't be predicted. What we can do is be designers. And if you think that sounds laissez-faire, you've never done a day's work of gardening in your life, because it involves digging and pruning, weeding, moving plants. You can see her garden is controlled. So the question is, what is the role of the designer, the steward of this evolving system? What does it mean to be an economist of an evolving system? And instead of those laws that they tried to find, that they are not economic laws of motion. We need to put design at the heart of 21st century economics. And I believe there are two design principles that we should really focus on if we're going to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. Being distributive and regenerative by design. I'll tell you briefly of each. Distributive by design means ensuring that value created is shared far more equitably with all of those who help to create it. And we can go to the source of wealth creation. So distributive design in housing could be cooperatively built and owned and run housing, as you can see here. This is from Germany. Distributive ownership of energy sources, communities that create their own energy source. And of course, it looks like a distributed network. If you look at renewable energy from space, it is a distributed network. In business, rather than having shareholders who own the company and they capture all the value, here's an example of an employee-owned company where the employees themselves reap the value of the work they've done. And innovation, rather than having everything under intellectual property rights like patents and copyright, working to expand the Creative Commons licensing. This is an example of a makerspace where people can come together and use public spaces to innovate and innovate in networks of research and development worldwide. So distributive design is already happening. And I hope you find the images of this as exciting. I love these pictures. It makes me feel like I really can see a new economy that's emerging based on distributive technologies. Regenerative design. Through the middle here is the 20th century degenerative economy that takes Earth's materials, makes them into stuff we want, uses it for a while and then throws it away. We need to bend those loops around and regenerate and restore both natural material but also synthetic materials that we make. This is of course the basis of a circular or cyclical economy. And the question that Janine Benyus asks, which I find mind-blowingly exciting, is how could we make a city as generous as a forest? This is New York City. Here's its nearby neighboring forest. So she goes to a nearby neighboring forest of a place and she asks, how much carbon does it sequester? How much biodiversity does it house? How much groundwater does it store? How much does it filter the air? How many nutrients does it cycle? And what would it look like to create cities that performed to that standard of nature? It's such an exciting idea, and I think she's a visionary for regenerative 21st century economics. So, if we're going to put these principles of regenerative and distributive design at the heart of the economy, what does that mean for GDP growth, that addiction of the 20th century? Well, growth, of course, is always imagined ever rising, but nothing in nature grows forever. If it does, it destroys the system on which it depends, and in our bodies, we know that as cancer. So actually what we want is to follow the growth path of nature, which is to grow until it is mature and then it comes to mature and thrive. What would it look like to create an economy that actually could mature and thrive? That's a question that fascinates me. But more than that, we need to stop having growth as the necessary target of the economic performance and become an adaptive variable that responds up and down as we pursue regenerative and distributive design. And that's profoundly what I mean by about being agnostic. It should be a variable that responds as we become more regenerative, as we move to being distributive. So instead of an airplane ride, I think of a kite surfer, moving with the wind and the waves and pulling the bar up and down in the middle to balance between the wind and the waves. That bar, which is moving, is like GDP in the future. The trouble is, we can't just jump there because we have, as Rosto explained, an economy in which growth has been structured into its very institutions so that we are financially, politically, and socially addicted to unending growth. Financially, because of that pursuit of gain, the rate of return at the heart of the financial system drives the current financial system to always accumulate. Politically, no leader wants to lose their place in this G20 family photo that is taken every year when they get together. But if their economy doesn't grow, then their neighbour's economy will grow and they'll get booted out by the next emerging powerhouse. And lastly, socially, we have been indoctrinated through a century of consumerist propaganda to believe that we improve ourselves by buying something more. How do we overcome the false idea that the best form of therapy is retail therapy? I don't think any of these addictions are insurmountable, but they all deserve far more attention than they currently get. So let me end with a new story of economics for the 21st century, a story which stars Earth because she is life-giving, so we must respect her boundaries. It stars the household because it's foundational, so we must nurture our connections. Sorry, it stars the society, which is foundational. The household is core, so value its contribution. Market is powerful, incredibly powerful instrument. That's why we must embed it wisely. The commons are incredibly creative, especially with the digital commons today. So how do we unleash their potential? And the state is essential. So how do we make it accountable? Finance, it should be its service. What would it look like to have a financial system that served society? Business is incredibly innovative. Surely it should have more purpose than merely maximizing profits. Indeed, it can. Trade is double-edged, so how do we make it fair? And power, it's everywhere. So we must talk about it and we must check its abuse. And I believe this is the beginning of a 21st century story that actually has a chance of allowing us to meet the needs of all within the means of the planet and to get into the donut. It comes with new pictures, of course. And if you agree with me about the power of pictures, you might enjoy looking at these videos that I've had the privilege to make with some of the world's best stop motion animators. One video about 1 minute long for each of the 7 ways of thinking in my book. As you can see, they're playful, they're funny. It's time to take economics out of the equations, out of the ivory towers, out of our heads, and bring it back into our hearts and our bellies, because we have to reanimate economics for the 21st century. So I'll stop there, and I very much look forward to discussing with you your critiques, your questions, your comments, your suggestions. Let's have a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was great and very inspiring. If people have questions, it's important that they talk into this microphone or Kate won't hear you. So anybody who have questions, if you could just come up and stand in a line, and we'll try to get some, we'll see how many questions there are. So I'll start with one, and as I speak, you can think of what your questions are. Oh, yeah, can you hear me now? There we go.
Bit better.
Yeah, my question is more about the GDP growth. And you say be agnostic about growth and throw the cuckoo out of the cuckoo nest, as you write in the book, which is the focus on GDP. But if you can just explain a bit more about that, because as you mentioned, the economy today is dependent on growth. And I mean, you see, like, you look at Marxist economic theory, you know, that the companies really are dependent on growing and also growing faster than the other companies. And if some companies try to have a different approach and do something else, they are simply outcompeted. So say something more about how is that true? Like, how is it possible to are we really not, is it not true that capitalist economy is dependent on growth to some extent?
Oh, okay, let me start with your last question. Is it not true that the capitalist economy is dependent upon growth? I'm just going to pick that word capitalist out. I don't use it because I don't know what you mean by capitalist economy. And if I start throwing around the word capitalist, I bet every single person in the room would actually define capitalism in a slightly different way. So I'm not wedded to a capitalist economy. I'm wedded to an economy that actually will meet the needs of all within the means of the planet. And what label somebody wants to stick on what we end up with, well, I mean, I call it a donut economy. That's too silly for, you know, for the serious newspapers. But it's an economy that is driven by distributive and regenerative design. I go backwards and ask, what kind of businesses are compatible with this? So, as you said, the problem that companies today face is if they don't grow, they get out-competed, or rather, what's really going to happen is that their shares are going to be sold off, because nobody wants to hold shares of a company that's losing market share. Now, that's not a problem with the company. That's coming to the design of corporate ownership and what we consider to be ownership and performance. At the moment, we have a design that the majority of companies in the world are quoted on the stock market, large ones I'm talking about, they're quoted on the stock market, and the idea is that they are therefore owned by people who have purchased a share or put in some money. The idea that the company's performance must be driven for their interest, and their interest is endless accumulation, because that's what seemed to be a good investor, right? That's rational. So we've got a design problem at the heart of this. It's not a problem with the business itself. In fact, many of the smartest businesses, they grow until they say, we're big enough, actually. Restaurants, or I have a friend who works in a cooperative making websites. They say, well, we're big enough. We don't want to grow anymore. This is a great size. There's 12 of us. It works really well. We don't need to keep growing. Let another cooperative spring up and let there be more of us. But they aren't owned by shareholders, and therefore they're not driven by this. You must keep growing. You must keep adding the value to your share. So it's a design problem. And I think of it very much like cancer, the multiplying. Anything that tries to grow endlessly, it has some sort of design function in it that it just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. It destroys the host on which it depends. We know it best as cancer in ourselves. We see it if a bacteria growing in a petri dish will eat up all the food and then the whole thing dies. Are we going to design our institutions like cancer? Are we going to design our finance system, our businesses, that they must always grow? Because we can see examples all around us of what happens. It destroys the system on which you depend. So we must start with life and the way that life works, and come back and ask the question, what kind of business, what kind of government regulation, what kind of policies, what kind of financial system is compatible, not with endlessly growing, but learning. So I mean, this is such an important flip, right? This curve is never actually drawn in the textbooks. It's so deeply implicit in the mind of everybody who's taught to study economics that growth, growth, growth. Nothing in nature does this except cancer, and then it dies because it kills the host. Everything in nature, like a tree, a plant, a child, your own feet, the Amazon forest, it grows until it matures and then it can thrive. So we want to learn to thrive. It's so deeply embedded, this growth mentality, but actually we've only been pursuing it for the last couple of 100 years, and there are other cultures in the world that don't pursue it at all. So we do have a chance of freeing ourselves from that trap.
Thank you. I have one question from Benedict. He'll come up. The rest of you can just come up because you have to speak into the microphone. And you can also ask to, if you don't want to speak in English, you can also just have your questions from where you're sitting and I will translate for you. That's also an option. Yeah, Benedict.
While they're coming, let me say I apologize if I was speaking a bit too fast sometimes. I get too excited when I talk about economics and I end up speaking fast, even for English people, so apologies.
No, but that's great to have someone who's excited. You know, it's a little bit of a change from the classroom, shall we say. No, that's not entirely true all the time. Anyway, beyond understanding ourselves, so to say, when we model the world in our pictures, you speak about dynamic complexity. So how far have we got in making such frameworks? Are they there already, or does one need to start from bottom up, or where are we at? Where do we find this? Where do we pick it up?
Great. Okay, that's a great question.
Collect the questions to have time. Did you write down?
Oh, a question. Okay.
Next question. Yeah. Okay. Speak very close to the microphone.
I'm sorry, I'm confused. Am I answering that one now, or am I getting another question now?
No, you get a new question, and you can see the speaker. She walks over here. Perfect.
Hello.
And just speak straight into the microphone.
Yeah, okay. So I wanted to ask how you imagine an economy or a society without perpetual growth.
So how do you imagine the society? And one more question, and then you can round up, and we'll leave it with that.
Where's the camera there? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Ivan here. Thank you for your presentation. I found it very interesting. I don't have depth understanding of economy, but what I do is that I try to do a very holistic use of how everything in society and individuals are interconnected in a larger whole. So I guess you could say I'm a holist. So what I was struck by is that you seem to be introducing a new paradigm of thinking economy that is moving more away from growth and toward care and, for lack of a better word, more feminine values, moving away from more masculine values. And what I look at in the world, for instance in Africa, it seems that a lot of good development is happening now by applying, actually, I get 2 microphones now, great. By applying the current system of economic thinking.
The other one was better, actually.
This one is better for
Yeah,
you?
that's much better,
Okay, cool.
much better.
So it seems like very clear that our model in the Western world is failing, right? But for our current level of cultural development, so we have a lot of abundance. But in Africa, it seems that it is working, the current model, for them, for the moment. And I would imagine that depending on context, we actually need slightly different models. And I just wonder how you are thinking about this, and if that sort of paradigm context awareness is part of your economic thinking, if that's clear.
Absolutely clear. That's fantastic. Okay, I'm going to start with your question.
There is actually a final one though. Can you?
Oh, okay. Go on
Do you
then.
have
Go on then.
capacity to remember that many questions? Julia, vær så god. Snakk veldig nærme den, og så har jeg den litt tilbake.
Thank you for your great lecture. Can you hear me?
Oh, she's frozen. Oh, there you go. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Good. Thank you for your great lecture. I have 2 questions. I would like to ask, do you have any reflections on Keynes and the macroeconomy? Studying Keynes, I see him as a very visionary thinker with regard to social justice and the ecology.
Beklager. Prøver jeg. Sånn det.
Oh, hun ringer nå.
There we are.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, I'm sorry. You got cut off just when you started saying your question. Can you say it again?
Yes. My question is about Keynes and the macroeconomy. Oh.
You just
Du må
need
bare
to
snakke
keep
veldig
your...
nærme.
Yeah.
Sånn.
Hello, can you hear me now? Yes.
Yeah.
My question is about Keynes and the macroeconomy. I see
Yeah.
Keynes as a very visionary thinker with regard to social justice and the ecology. But Keynes is misused for the macroeconomy and economic growth. How do we come beyond this dilemma? How do we get back the visionary thinking of Keynes? My second question is about the 6-hour workday. What do we say when that is counted as unrealistic?
Thank you. You won't have much time to answer all these questions. I'm sorry, Kate. So I guess you'll have to see what you have time for. I'll give you. You have 4 minutes to answer.
Yes,
5
4 minutes. Great. Okay, am I sharing my screen with you? Can you all see my graph?
No, we can only
No,
see you.
I'm not sharing my screen with you. Of course I'm not sharing my screen with you. You can just see me. Much more interesting to see my screen. Okay, right. Now can you see the graph?
It's coming very soon. Yeah, you can just start talking.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the question from the holist. I didn't catch your name, holist, but I like your iconic name of holist. I'm a holist too. So you said, surely there are countries in the world where growth is actually coming. Absolutely. So look at this graph. Low down on this curve, where the gradient is steepest, I would say places like Ethiopia, Cambodia, they're there. They are growing 7 to 10% a year, and it's fantastic that they're growing because the market exchange is growing, right? The monetized economy is growing, and it will, if it's done well and reinvested in health and education, and it's done in a regenerative and distributive way, it will bring up well-being. It can lead that country to thrive. But so the countries come up the growth curve. This is a curve from nature. Everything in nature grows like this. So how do we ask ourselves, can we actually belong to the planet we are from, and can we learn to grow like this? So low-income countries come up that curve, but what happens when you come near to the top? So yes, different countries are at a different point on that curve, and the question is, where are today's high-income countries? I'll go to the second question of the lady who said, how can I imagine that we could grow without, what would it look like to have an economy that was without perpetual growth? I would say, look at nature, look at the 3 billion years of thriving that nature has achieved on this planet. This curve is nature's curve. This is what nature does. And then things decline, and then they're regenerated, and they come back as something else. And of course, in our bodies, we don't perpetually grow. We grow, we thrive, and then we die, and we come back as something else. We must reinvent our economic institutions, which are merely human imaginative constructs, so that they also can thrive. They've been constructed to actually endlessly accumulate. Nothing else in the world does that. We need to reconstruct them, otherwise we become a cancer of our own societies. The question about Keynes was visionary, and he actually was moving towards complexity thinking. I would say he was very powerfully committed to social justice, and he believed that the way to create full employment was to promote growth. And in his day, let's look again at this curve, in his day there was a close correlation between a growing economy and better employment for all. The correlation has come apart. Oh, hell.
No,
Have we been split off?
We just turned off the
Oh, you can still hear me? Okay. You can hear me, not hear me? Okay, I'll finish.
We can see you, you can see us.
You can hear me?
But
Okay,
the audio
I'll
is
finish.
bad, so just speak slowly.
Okay, sorry. You gave me 4 minutes. Complexity economics. So in terms of understanding humanity, some people have started doing agent-based modeling. Rather than putting the character rational economic man at the heart of it, they put a little character who has rules and patterns that he follows or she follows, and then they look at the emergent property that emerges from this. But if you look at the financial crisis, this was a really good example. There was no complexity thinking going on before the financial crisis, but after it, many people turned to the work of Hyman Minsky, whose financial instability hypothesis really explains well what happened and what will happen again. And if you read the work of Minsky, he talks in reinforcing and balancing feedback. So the greatest thinkers who can explain today's problems are already using systems thinking to do their work. And I'll end with the comment again from the holist who said, he was just noting that the diagrams I had seemed to be more feminine. And many people have said that. If you look at the old diagrams, they say they're very masculine, they're just great rising lines, very sort of thrusting male diagrams of endless growth. Whereas the 21st century diagrams, some of them are mine, but many of them I've drawn together from others, they're more cyclical, they look much more feminine. And I think that's a very interesting point. And maybe there should be also many more women in economics, because certainly as a mother involved in physical reproduction of children, but also the reproductive economy of raising children, I see the world in terms of cycles, cycles of life, cycles of the planet, cycles of industry, and cycles into which we must embed our economic activity. So I'll leave it with that we need both women and men bringing their experience, their deep bodily experience, and their perception and the world views into economics. And thank you so much for having me. Great questions, and I wish I was there.
Thank you so much, Kate. This is wonderful. Thank you so much.
I'm actually now going to go off to the Commons this morning. A group of us, we have an orchard. We picked all the apples from our orchard yesterday, and we're turning it into apple juice today. So it's a little commons that I belong to, and I'm going to leave you with the last thought. Look for the commons in your life, the communities that you're a part of, that you belong to, where you co-create things that you value, because if there's one thing we can do is help bring back understanding of the commons in 21st century economics, because we need them. I'll leave it with that. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.